We begin here. Standard Bank says it has not manipulated the value of the rand, nor engaged in any anti-competitive or criminal conduct. In a statement, the bank says such claims are false. The bank further says comments made on social media platform incorrectly link various unrelated and unfounded allegations with the Competition Commission inquiry currently under adjudication before the Competition Appeal Court. On Friday, National Treasury said the alleged currency collusion with which the Competition Commission has charged 28 banks did not influence the rand exchange rate and is not the cause of the rand's decline over the past decade. UK-based banking group Standard Chartered Bank recently admitted guilt in the investigation, which has been ongoing since 2017, and paid a penalty. SCB and 27 other banks, local and multinationals, have been implicated in the probe. Local bank Standard Bank says it defends itself against what they call false allegations. Standard Bank says it is committed to behaving with the complete integrity at all times, and its long-run performance depends on the success of the economy and on the economic well-being of their clients. All right, now let's discuss the impact of this on ordinary South Africans. We're now joined via Teams by Senior Research Fellow and Political Economist at Trade Collective, Ms. Lebohang Pheko. Ms. Pheko, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. So the Competition Commission indicated that some of the banks implicated in the manipulation of the rand have generated about R1 trillion a day between 2007 and 2017. On Friday, on the other hand, National Treasury says the alleged currency collusion with which the Competition Commission has charged these banks did not influence the rand exchange rate and is not the cause of the rand's decline over the past decade. Let's talk then about just how prevalent currency manipulation is in the country and, of course, its impact on South Africans.
Sure. I mean, let's begin with the 1 trillion rand a day, because that's what's been doing the rounds, I think, on social media and in the public media as well. That's not even economically possible. So I think it's important as media practitioners for us to educate and inform the public as best as possible. If to put that into perspective, the value of the total GDP of the country in the first quarter of that year was about 1.4 trillion rands. And then for the entire year was for 4.7 trillion rands. So imagine that, if generating R1 trillion a year is actually more than generating the entire state fiscus, it's not really feasible. And I think even when we look at the rand to dollar exchange for that time, what banks globally were generating would barely be able to meet those sorts of amounts. Secondly, yes, you ask an important question about whether or not we can ascribe entirely the responsibility of the decline of the rand over the past 10 or 12 years to this manipulation. And that's kind of a no and a yes. And I would say no because I think firstly, we have systems in place that have been that have been difficult to function, that have not been functioning well. Firstly, we don't have very good currency control. We don't practice currency sovereignty, which I'll talk about later, which is basically ways in which you cap the limits on what is available of your currency in the public market, which helps it to avoid depreciation. Thirdly, we had the basic fundamentals of employment and other things which have hampered that, like the COVID-19 pandemic, like the 2008 meltdown, the Wall Street meltdown as well. But, my concern is that at some stage, as South Africa and as South African policymakers, it's also important to take ownership and agency for the things that are within the remit of the state. So, for example, we are able to put in place taxes and tariffs at particular moments where we can see if particular imports and exports are hampering or invading our own space. So if we see that there are particular imports which are perhaps driving down the cost of our own products, we can then put in place anti-competitive measures by putting in taxes that are so high that it's difficult for those products to be imported. Nigeria has done it with their rice products. Ethiopia has done it with their lentils, with their wheat. It's a commonly used tactic. Other things that we are able to do, we are able to play around a bit more with our inflation, with our interest rates. And as we understand, these are what enable small businesses, for example, to borrow off the cost of anticipated earnings, right? And to capitalize potentially in anticipation of earnings that are coming in. Now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of small businesses did not get the support that they needed. So in the midst of that, the cost of exporting and importing products that they may have needed for their businesses would, of course, have been extremely expensive and extremely onerous. And many businesses instead went out of business, unemployment went up, and so forth. So we have, at some stage, statistics say that about 1,000 businesses per week were going under during the COVID-19 pandemic. So there are all of these other policy-owned goals that have been taking place. However, many things can be true at the same time. So the collusion that has taken place is absolutely unacceptable, and the ways in which it has possibly had an impact. So, I mean, if we see a 44% depreciation, as I say, some of it can be apportioned to our own goals. But if there's any inkling that any amount of that is to do, and this is the thing now, it's difficult to measure where one begins and the other ends. But if there's any possibility that this has hampered our economy any more than it already is, certainly deep actions, important actions, and actions that signal that South Africa is not going to be treated like a corporate football on the international plane should be taken into account.
And thank you so much for that R1 trillion remark and correction, particularly because the Competition Commission said that it had fined the two banks that had come forward, relative to their operations in South Africa. But now let's revisit, if we may, what happened in 2001 when the rand collapsed from 7 rand 60 cents to 13 rand 84 cents to the US dollar. Subsequently, the Rand Commission was then established. Just talk to us about some of the recommendations that were made by that commission and how these could have effectively prevented this latest case, in terms of your words, these own goal policies.
The thing that's really unfortunate is that we seem to be going over the motions, over and over again. And I think that what happened there are two parts of that. There's the main report, which was released in August 2002. And then, of course, there's the minority report, the very influential minority report, which was released later that year by Advocate Christine Kunta. So what they found at the time was that the main commission didn't think that there had been currency manipulation or the attempt to depreciate, even though external courts, for example, in New York, had found that this had been, in fact, been the case. So what they found was that they said it was impossible to investigate the 5.6 million foreign exchange transactions that had been put in place during that time. But they said that it was important to concentrate on the activities of the major dealers. And that's something that we're missing in this particular instance. They also analyzed a few, what they called hot days when the most rapid currency depreciation had occurred during that time. And one of the recommendations was that there have to be different arrangements to the satisfaction of authorized dealers to ensure that confidential information that is in the possession of all stakeholders on the value chain of currency transactions doesn't leak. That confidential information should not be disclosed to the public. And at the time, they also mentioned that they needed to have, to put in place a speedy investigation, that they needed to have considered and coherent evidence. And for the purposes of this conversation, that there needs to be accurate reporting of the evidence by the media. Bearing in mind, then, of course, then there was also the at the same time, banks in the offshore were being charged. So the Deutsche Bank paid about 1 billion, rands at the time. And when we look in the context of this 42 million chump change that Standard Chartered Bank has just paid, that's basically a donation. That's not even a commission. And when we look in the context of what banks actually make, we can see that we're not being taken very seriously, and that many of the requirements of the original finding were not even taken into account. But it's also important to note that in the context of that Med Christine Kunta felt that there had been much more onerous and much more intentional currency manipulation. She was extremely unhappy and wrote a 600-page, for those who have the stomach over Christmas holidays, perhaps, to read that, but she wrote a 600-page report. And I think that if our compatriot has gone through that trouble, perhaps a few more of us should glance at it. And her argument was that it cannot be that these were just spontaneous interactions. It cannot be that the rand just spiraled out of coincidence. And she was also calling for much greater corporate accountability, and that the banking sector has to put in place much stronger controls, capital controls, to ensure that our currency cannot be manipulated so easily. And then 20 years later, here we are all over again.
Ms. Pheko, for the last question, I'm going to ask you to be very brief. We have run out of time, but I want to squeeze this last one in, considering the things that you are saying. Let's talk about corporate accountability, and also what role the Reserve Bank plays, what role does the presidency plays in the form of President Cyril Ramaphosa, particularly in light of this Rand Commission report in 2002, and subsequently Ms. Kunta's report, 600 pages, all of it, and the likes of the Kevin Wakeford, who blew the whistle on this. You know, where is the accountability, and how can it happen fast?
Yes. So I think a lot of people have been asking about the role of the Reserve Bank in all of this, and suggesting that the role of the Reserve Bank cannot be merely to ensure that, to influence the currency direction over the long term, but that in fact the role of the Reserve Bank is also to enable the movement of money and monetary, to change monetary policy to react to these sorts of short-term moves, because it's, even if it has far-reaching implications and far-reaching consequences for the rest of the economy. And I think a few of us have been arguing for some time that the Reserve Bank has to be a bit more activist in some of its responses, and a bit more agile. And I think the other piece is then to think around how it is possible, for example, for the Reserve Bank to then think about how money moves and where money moves to. So a country, for example, such as China, is able to preserve the power of its currency because it has huge amounts of dollars in reserve. It has the largest dollar reserve in the world, more than the United States, by the way, which of course causes some irritation and disturbance to the United States. And we need to think around how we are going to think about decentering the dollar US, because a lot of this is happening because we are pegged to the dollar US. And this has been a problem since most currencies around the world then delinked from the gold exchange to the dollar, to this artificial dollar exchange, which is really an arbitrary thing that the US decided in the 1970s, and for some reason the rest of the world complied with. So there are bigger conversations about delinking from the dollar, about dealing in different baskets of currency, so that we can decenter the notion that if our currency is not strong in relation to the dollar US, it means then that it is completely worthless, or that we are in deep crisis. That doesn't have to be the case.
Ms. Pheko, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Really do appreciate your analysis. Of course, that was Ms. Lebohang Pheko, and she is a senior research fellow and political economist at Trade Collective, just unpacking the consequences of the rand, of course, and rand manipulation, as well as currency manipulation.